Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 131, Taking Control. With the new and unexpected acquisition of the lower leader subclass, to say that in front of Xietain a new world with infinite doors representing countless possibilities had appeared was not an exaggeration in the least. The power that the lower leader subclass provided him at the moment was truly pitiful and could practically be easily ignored. However, this was so at this moment only because Xietain had a total of just over 1,000 people under his control. But what would happen when that number grew? What if at some point Xietain came to control the entire Yongqing district? How about all of Beijing? How about all of China? Even more terrifying. How about the whole planet Earth? Xietain's subclass was currently at the lowest possible point, but when he had 10,000 survivors under his rule, the subclass would evolve to the next level and the power provided would probably increase by a notch. But the real increase in power was with the survivors. For every 1,000 survivors, Xietain's power would increase by 0.1%. Such an amount might not be too much, but if at some point he could once again unite all of China's surviving inhabitants under his flag, the increase in power would undoubtedly be massive. Xietain shuddered at the thought of such terrifying entities as the various leaders of the higher existences. They already had their own armies with hundreds of thousands and even millions of terrifying beings, and at the same time received a great boost of power due to their positions as leaders and rulers. Seeing that time passed and he still remained silent, Shangguan Bingshui and the rest who were standing on the stage a short distance away frowned, wondering if there was something wrong. Forget it. Let's focus on what we can fix and leave what is beyond our control for later. Xietain sighed secretly and shook his head slightly before turning his attention to the survivors who were still staring at him waiting for his words. These people, as useless as some might be, were now a treasure in Xietain's eyes. If he wanted to help Lilith and achieve his own ever higher ambitions, he needed power, and the survivors were the fuel that could give him power just by being there. My name is Xietain and I am the strongest person in this place. He began his monologue with a deep voice and a cold gaze. I have already taken care of killing the 4 previous leaders of this place, and now my people and I are claiming this village as our temporary base. Hearing that the previous village leaders had been killed, the survivors muttered under their breath but did not seem too surprised. After all, the battle between Xietain and the militants as well as Yicigong had been heard by all. The gunshots and explosions had made it clear that there was a terrifying battle raging, and since the unknown young man was on the stage, but none of the previous bosses were anywhere to be seen, it was easy to assume what had happened in the end. Starting from today, each of you will receive relief rations consisting of 3 bowls of gruel per day. If you want to eat better, or if you want to be able to eat your fill, then you will have to work to earn it. Xietain declared coldly and narrowed his eyes. I won't let anyone starve, but I hate leeches. At the slightest case of disobedience, social disorder, rape, street violence, or homicide, that person will be executed without mercy. Although the survivors were a treasure to him, firm rules were needed, and this was even more so in a world that was filled with chaos as Earth currently was. Therefore, Xietain could not afford to waver with his attitude even if he had acquired a subclass. Although his words were somewhat cruel, none of the survivors seemed upset. On the contrary, they all had glints of joy in their eyes. After all, before they could barely eat a bowl of gruel under the rule of Yicigong and the other 3 bosses, but now that Xietain was taking over they could all eat much more. If anyone is dissatisfied, you can take your personal belongings and leave the village at will. Xietain pointed out indifferently. If you live under my protection and eat my food, then you will obey my orders. Now, you may all disperse and return to your homes. Tomorrow, at sunrise, all those who are interested in getting a job or becoming part of the new army troops should congregate at this very place. Leaving those words behind, Xietain ignored the applause and even exclamations of joy and walked off the stage. Everyone was ecstatic. Especially when they heard that everyone could get jobs, to eat better, and even had the opportunity to join the army troops of the village and get some firearms. In this new world, firearms were the easiest and most efficient source of protection for the survivors. Therefore, Xietain's words had tempted hundreds of men and women. Under the leadership of his new housekeeper, Qin Ming, Xietain was guided to the main village. On the other hand, Shangguan Bing Shui, Wu Yijun, Gao Min, Li Na, and Fan Wu would be sharing Du Ming's villa. As friends, it was natural to live together, and since the villa was large enough to accommodate a dozen people, there would be no problem. As for Chen, he had Lei Su's villa to himself. Different women had been prearranged as maids for the different villas. These women who had been forced by the different bosses or used and then thrown aside were delighted, as they would not only be safer living under the same roof as strong people, but they could also receive better treatment and eat better food than the rest of the survivors. Because Luo Qing and Luo Ning's house had been destroyed by the militants who had raided during the night, a house closer to the center of the village had been quickly arranged for both of them. The girl had easily entered Bai Zemin's heart, as her innocence and purity reminded him of his younger sister Meng Qi. It was also for this reason that he wanted her to be closer to his grasp, and fortunately the girl had been sleeping until now, so she was not too aware of the disaster, or else who knows what her reaction would be. "Why didn't you name me your housekeeper?" Lilith asked with an adorable pout as she bounced up and down on the comfy sprung bed. She had already returned to her original form, and her overwhelming charm, along with her two moving mountains, was simply irresistible. Bai Zemin couldn't help but let his eyes wander to her breast for a moment before returning to her face and saying through gritted teeth, "You little minx. If I had appointed you my housekeeper, wouldn't you send me to my own death? What is all this master bullshit?" Just imagining the seductive Lilith calling him master made his blood burn to the brim. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 132. Sad Bai Zemin and kind Shangguan Bing Shui. The next day, in the center of the village square, several tables were set up with a group of people behind them. Gao Min looked at the nearly 1,000 survivors surrounding the place and felt a little awkward. They all looked like hungry wolves ready to pounce on their prey at any moment. However, she gritted her teeth and endured as she shouted loudly, "From now on, everyone can approach a table and announce what kind of knowledge you have. From mechanics and blacksmithing to general medicine, anything that can help will be welcome, and you will be rewarded based on your work." Indeed, these survivors were hungry wolves. However, the reason why they did not dare to cause any disturbance was to be attributed to Fu Xiefeng, Kai Jingyi, Kong Lan, Zhong De, Luo Qing, and the other militants who had decided to follow Bai Zemin. All of them were holding a gun and observing the surroundings coldly. If anyone tried to be too rough, they had Bai Zemin's order to punish the offender without hesitation. On the other side of the square, Wu Yijun stood in the center and announced in a melodious voice, "All those whose age is between 18 and 40 who wish to apply to join the new army troops, come to me. You must announce your name, occupation prior to the arrival of the soul record, and your physique must be in good condition to fight at any time." The crowd immediately became agitated and hundreds of people began to line up. Due to the sheer number of people, it was impossible for there not to be some disorder, even more so considering that everyone was clear that it was impossible to arm all of them, so no one wanted to be left out because they were too slow. All those who skip the line or push will be rejected immediately and will also have no chance of getting a regular job. When Fan Wu shouted those words, the small chaos that threatened to spread immediately calmed down, and the survivors began to move orderly with eyes filled with dread. None of them wanted to miss out on a golden opportunity like this. It was only then, when order settled down, that the first day of recruitment officially began. Meanwhile, on a highway on the way east of the newly named beginning village, 2 modified buses, 2 tractor-trailers, and a cargo truck moved forward as a lone unit, defying the dangers lurking everywhere. Sitting in one of the front seats of the first bus, Bai Zemin looked out the window with his face resting on one hand. As he watched the scenery pass by, his eyes flashed with a complicated glint. Sitting next to him, Lilith in her lily form occasionally looked at him out of the corner of her eye with a small glint of concern. But even she didn't know what to say, so she simply stayed silent, trying to support him with her presence. The reason why Bai Zemin was somewhat depressed was because they were currently moving towards the place where he worked before the apocalypse fully broke out. Because they needed more advanced tools to be able to work better in modifying vehicles and to repair those that were damaged but could be useful. Even to dismantle vehicles, they needed the right tools to avoid damaging the different parts. Besides, he also wanted to obtain the blacksmithing tools from the old man if possible. That was precisely why he, Chen He, and Shangguan Bing Shui, along with other survivors who would do the logistical work, moved to obtain these resources. The fact that the 3 strongest leaders were moving showed how important this move was. After all, if they obtained the tools, would finally be able to start working with the bodies of the mutated beasts and the evolved first-order beasts. Although Xietain could not say that he and the other employees of the place were like family, he had a very good relationship with all of them. Especially with the old blacksmith elder, who was the one who had introduced him to the job when he needed it. The man was over 60 years old, but Xietain could tell that he really appreciated him. He even taught him many things about blacksmithing, and even when Xietain didn't understand or made many mistakes, the old man always smiled and told him that everything was okay, that for the next one he could surely do it far better. It was precisely thanks to him that Xietain had the option to obtain the main class blacksmith in his evolution to First Order. Approximately 20 minutes later, the small convoy stopped in front of a single-story building with an extension of several hundred meters in length and width. The sound of the engines had attracted several surrounding zombies, totaling more than 70 beings carrying a deadly infection. Although they were only 3 people, the 3 of them had already defied hordes of hundreds of zombies, and the number of enemies that had perished at their hands totaled at least tens of thousands if not more. After a quick 2 to 3 minutes work, all the zombies were decapitated with ease. Xietain and the other 2 had firearms, but considering the shortage of ammunition as well as the various setbacks that the sound of gunshots could bring, the 3 of them eliminated the zombies with bladed weapons. Even Chen He wielded a Xianyuan sword to decapitate zombies and was surprisingly good with the sword. He had obviously not only trained his archery skills throughout his life. With a Type 79 submachine gun slung over his shoulder, a Desert Eagle and a Xianyuan sword at his waist, it could be said that Xietain was armed to the teeth. He stared at the broken glass of the workshop for several seconds before he began to walk inside without saying a word. Shangguan Bing Shui, Chen He, and Lilith followed closely behind. Lilith ignored the strange looks she was receiving from Shangguan Bing Shui and Chen He, focusing on the back of the young man in front of her. Xietain walked without stopping, turning into some corridors and passing some doors. Anyone could tell that he knew the place well enough to move around as if it were his own home. But how could he not know the place? After all, this had been the place where he had been working for almost 3 years. Along the way there were several bloodstains, torn clothes, and even some iron tools with bloodstains and human flesh stuck on the metal. Bang! Arriving in front of a sheet metal door, Xietain kicked it noisily as if to announce that he was there. However, upon seeing the sight inside, he froze for a moment before sighing with slightly sad eyes. Less than 10 meters away, an old man whose hair had turned completely white could be seen sitting in a chair. His clothes were in a bad state and there was a large bloody wound on his right arm. Hearing the sound of the door banging open, the old man staggered to his feet as he grunted almost inaudibly. Xietain looked at the old man's lifeless and completely white eyes, and he could not help but sigh inwardly again, and although he knew to some extent that something like this could happen, what he did not expect was that it would be more difficult to accept than he initially thought. Since the beginning of the apocalypse, Xietain had danced hand in hand with death on many occasions, and there were even several times when his life hung in the balance. However, with effort, he gritted his teeth and managed to defeat all his enemies. From normal zombies and evolved zombies to mutated and evolved beasts, even other humans. All that existence that somehow blocked his path was eradicated with his own hands. Therefore, seeing an acquaintance and even something dear to him having been turned into a zombie, the shock Xietain received was greater than expected, as it made him realize that although he was strong, he was still as weak as any other human being to cases like the one in front of him. Perhaps being able to sense his complex emotions and his declining mood, Lilith hugged him gently from behind and rested her head on his back. This surprised him and the others, but none of them had time to think too much. Shangguan Bing Shui looked at Xietain with complicated eyes as she naturally realized that the old man and he must have had a good relationship in the past. An idea flashed in her mind and raised both hands as she pointed forward. Freeze. Her cold voice echoed off the walls and a blast of terrifying frost shot forward from her body. Her face turned slightly pale, but her expression did not change. Under the eyes of Chen He, Xietain, and Lilith, the old man's infected body froze into a frost statue. From head to toe, completely frozen. She clenched both fists and with a soft pop, the frost statue exploded into tiny pieces of ice with a size and thickness similar to a hair. The faint rays of light shining through the broken window shone on the tiny flakes floating gently in the air, creating a wonderful view difficult to describe in mere words. When all the flakes fell to the ground, Xietain looked at her gratefully and nodded. After all, what she had done was actually very kind. Not only had she prevented him from killing a familiar person with his own hands, but she had also given the old man eternal rest in such a beautiful way. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 133 Reinforced Iron Bore. Xietain soon made some effort and pushed the whole previous matter to the back of his head. Although a bit of rest to clear his mind and think better about what to do next would be good for him, it was also very clear to him that stopping was the same as giving the opportunity for other existences to devour him. With no other option and now even more motivated to cross the Yanqing district and reach the Chongping district to join his family. The previous case had not caused Xietan's faith and trust in his loved ones to waver, it only motivated him to work even harder to achieve his goal of reaching them as soon as possible. Under his orders, the survivors began to carry different tools to the cargo truck and tractor trailers. The survivors of the beginning village knew very well that working for Xietain and the others meant better meals and the possibility to eat their fill, so once the surrounding zombies were eliminated, they all began to work vigorously. Roar! Suddenly there was a thunderous roar in the distance that startled the survivors. The ground began to shake lightly, and little by little the rumbling became more prominent, indicating the approach of something of considerable size. About 200 meters away, several trees were knocked down, and under the terrified eyes of the survivors, a boar over 5 meters tall that seemed to be made of iron charged forward fiercely. At the sight of the humans, the beast's eyes turned red and it roared again as it charged forward with determination. The panicked survivors began to scream and drop their tools in an attempt to flee. Bang! Xietain shot into the air several times and shouted at the top of his lungs, "Stay where you are, damn it. If you stay away from here, by the time I kill this fucking pig, you'll all be thrown out of the village." At the sound of gunfire and hearing his clearly angry voice as well as his threatening words, the survivors stopped trying to flee in disorder but still fled into the building to seek cover. He narrowed his eyes and raised his Type 85 sniper in the direction of the giant boar. The Type 85 sniper was an antique semi-automatic weapon from 1963, but even today it was sometimes used by the army because of its power. Although it could not compare to the power of some of the same type of more modern weapons, it was one of the weapons with the greatest penetrating power among those currently available in Xietan's group. Bang! Bang! In a second, He opened fire twice. He was smart and knew that the giant boar's defense would be amazing, one only needed to pay attention to the metallic sheen of its scales to come to such a simple conclusion. Therefore, he took special aim at the beast's 2 eyes. However, what happened next was beyond everyone's expectations. When the two 7.62 by 54 mm armor-piercing bullets were just a few centimeters away from hitting the beast, a strange energy invisible to the naked eye seemed to distort, decreasing the power of the bullets enormously and slowing their speed, which gave the giant boar enough time to close both eyes. Tink! Tink! Both bullets fell to the ground after a slight sound of metal hitting metal. What? Shangguan Bingshue's eyes flashed with disbelief and her small mouth slightly opened in complete shock at what she had just witnessed. He sucked in a breath of cold air and unconsciously took a step back. Even Xietain himself was astonished. "I told you so." Lilith's voice sounded inside his head. First-order existences are almost immune to firearms developed with this world's technology, and probably only those with weaker defense are afraid of them. Only heavy weapons are a real threat to them. Xietain took a deep breath and without warning burst forward with an astonishing speed that no survivor could understand or glimpse. As the giant boar charged like an unstoppable locomotive, an ant-sized existence flashed before their crimson eyes. With no intention of stopping, it charged even more ferociously. Unfortunately, while it was true that Xietain was incomparable to the overall size of the giant boar, the power his small body possessed was no joke. He raised his Xianyuan sword high and slashed fiercely downward as if to cut the giant boar in two. When the sword blade connected against the beast's body, a thunderous explosion reverberated everywhere and the ground shook fiercely. The giant boar roared painfully as it was forced to retreat. Right in the center of its forehead, its scales cracked and a great torrent of blood gushed out from the open flesh, staining its entire face and giving it a horrifying appearance. Xietain himself felt his arms numb after the strike. But this was because the sword in his hands no longer had the ability to pierce through the enemy's defenses before him. The only reason he had managed to wound the monster was because he had monstrous strength. However, as a consequence, his arms suffered a bit. The giant boar's eyes flashed strangely, and its scales suddenly took on a slight glow that was stronger than before. A first-order existence with a defensive active skill. Xietain immediately concluded and was about to continue when a blast of frost flew past him. The giant boar's body became much slower, and if one looked closely one would easily discover chunks of ice on its legs, knees, back, even its tail. Looking out of the corner of his shoulder, he saw Shangguan Bing Shui gritting her teeth and relentlessly channeling her skill. These kinds of beasts were her nemesis, as her ice skill did not have a destructive power high enough to break through a defense as strong as that of the giant boar. Without pausing to give the enemy time to react and seizing the opportunity, Xietain jumped high into the sky and soared almost 7 meters in less than a second. He united both fists and punched mercilessly downward. Boom! After such a horrendous blow, a huge shock wave spread outward with the place hit by Xietain as the center, and even some nearby trees were shattered by the aftershock of the attack. The giant boar's eyes quivered and it opened its maw to howl in pain, but all that came out of its mouth was a large amount of fresh blood along with several pieces of flesh coming from its organs that had been fiercely shaken by the previous blow. As the creature fell to the ground, Xietain raised the Xianyuan sword and began to slash as if he had gone mad. 1, 2, 3. In just a matter of a second, he had already slashed more than 50 times with all his strength. The giant boar didn't even have time to cry out as its brain was turned to pulp from the outside and its skull sank inward with blood gushing out endlessly. You have acquired the soul power of First Order Reinforced Iron Boar level 49. Health plus 20, Stamina plus 15, Strength plus 8. You have leveled up and reached level 36. You have gained. You have leveled up and reached level 37. You have gained 2 status points to distribute freely. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 134 Government Transmission. When the reinforced iron boar fell, the survivors who had sought shelter inside the building looked at the young man standing on the back of the huge creature with eyes filled with disbelief. Before this, the survivors had occasionally seen Yi Qigong, Du Meng, Lei Su, and Yang Pei activating their skills to make demonstrations of the supernatural power they possessed. In that way they would not only be able to urge more people to fight but also be able to show the difference in power, instilling fear in them. However, this was the first time they had seen someone so powerful. Everyone knew instinctively that if the reinforced iron boar appeared in the village and launched a charge-type attack, then no one would be able to stop its wild madness. Even the 4 previous leaders would have to flee or die. When the survivors saw the skills and monstrous strength of the 4 leaders back, then they felt fear. But when they witnessed Xietan's display of power, what they felt mostly was gratitude, surprise, and reverence. This was because when the power between 2 beings reached a point where it was simply impossible to comprehend, fear, envy, or hatred automatically turned into reverence and admiration. Humans were greedy and envious by nature, but didn't they worship different gods? This was because the difference in power in their minds between them and those existences was simply impossible to compare, so it made no sense to be envious. This was a similar case. Xietain looked at the Xianyuan sword in his right hand and sighed. He really needed a new weapon since the strength of his current sword did not have the ability to pierce the defenses of enemies above level 40, and even when it managed to pierce their defenses he needed to consume large amounts of stamina. At least for now, he would have to make do with the sword as it was not easy to obtain a new weapon stronger than his current one. After all, the Xianyuan sword was a rare grade treasure and at the top of its category, therefore at least a magic grade treasure was necessary to surpass it. Xietain circled around the beast's corpse several times and found a red orb and a skill scroll. Piercing glove, normal treasure attacks performed with this weapon allow the user to pierce through the defense of almost any enemy below level 25. When equipped, strength plus 5. Wild charge, unranked active skill, level 5, turn into a shadow capable of traveling 10 meters in a straight line within 0.01 seconds. This skill can only be used once every 2 minutes. After thinking for a moment, Xietain decided to learn the Wild Charge skill. The scroll in his hands disappeared into particles of light, and a rune with the drawing of a bull formed deep within his soul. You have learned an active external skill. You can learn 3 additional external skills. Good job. A cheerful voice brought him out of his inner thoughts, and as looked ahead he saw Shangguan Bingshui, Chen He, and Lilith slowly approaching. Xietain smiled slightly and nodded to Lilith, who had praised him and was looking at him with a bright smile. Shangguan Bingshui even raised an eyebrow at their exchange. Even a fool could tell that the relationship between the two of them was anything but normal. Maid? More than that, they look like a couple or close friends. Chen He whispered under his breath. Although it was a small whisper, it was impossible for it to escape the ears of people strong as the others, let alone from such a close distance. Xietain ignored him and threw the piercing glove to Shangguan Bingshui, since he had won and since she had done her part, deserved something too. She took the treasure without saying a word and nodded towards him. The survivors finished carrying the 2 tractor trailers with mechanics' tools and blacksmith tools that were used in ancient times. While there were modern tools for blacksmithing, the old man liked the ancient methods of forging, as he always told Xietain that by relying too much on technology one's skill would begin to rust. Because Xietain together with Shangguan Bingshui and Chen He had moved the giant corpse of the reinforced iron boar to the Dongfeng truck, they had no choice but to look for 2 other trucks nearby to transport the rest of the stuff. Even with the 3 of them together, it was almost impossible to lift the body of the beast, and they had to do it bit by bit, taking them almost 2 hours, as it was not only incredibly heavy, but they also had to be careful or the truck would be crushed by the size and weight of the first-order creature. When Xietain and the rest arrived at the beginning village, it was already past noon. What is that? My God. It looks like a mythological beast. They even hunted such a terrifying monster. Due to its size, it was impossible to hide the body of the reinforced iron boar. When the few survivors who were walking around the village aimlessly, or those who were in the square registering to try to get a job, saw the 4-meter beast being carried and the dried blood on its body, they couldn't help but be scared and shocked. The reverence, as well as the gratitude of being under the protection of such powerful people, added another notch. Inside the villa that was used as a meeting hall, Xietain was sitting on a sofa with a frown on his face as he looked at the radio in front of him. On the sides, Shangguan Bingshui, Chen He, and Wu Yijuan, who had temporarily stopped enlisting, were looking at the radio and at him intermittently. This is Mayor Bai Yong of Baiquan Subdistrict. I hope that you, who are listening to this broadcast, are safe and secure. In case you need shelter, food, security, the government in conjunction with the military troops of Baiquan Subdistrict have managed to establish a safe zone in the area between Ruilin Subdistrict and Baiquan Subdistrict of Yanqing District. The arms of the government are open to welcome you at all times. A recorded transmission that discussed a little about the world situation was constantly repeated from the satellite radio. Xietan's eyes had a strange glint in them as he secretly thought, so the government really did manage to set up a small base. Although he already expected it, since it was simply impossible for humanity's armed troops to fall so quickly when most of the enemies were slow and unintelligent zombies, the warning bells rang in his head noisily. I don't think the person in charge of the place is unaware of the leader subclass. He thought with narrowed eyes as he gently tapped the wooden table with his finger. He had already discussed the matter with Lilith the night before, and she had made it clear to him that existence could only obtain a subclass upon reaching the 2nd order. However, there was one exception to this rule: those who met occult requirements. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 135. It's harder to be a good leader than a good tyrant. If it was in the past, as long as the government and the military gave him a good incentive and treatment, Xietain might have been willing to work together with them. After all, the human race was in danger of being completely annihilated, and if he received the support of the military and the government, it might be much easier for him to reach Chongping District, where his family was located. The problem was that Xietain alone simply did not have the ability to reach his family on his own. Yanqing District had approximately 5 million people before the apocalypse, and because it was an ecological area, the forests were numerous. How was he alone to face millions of zombies and countless mutated and evolved beasts? Even if he was strong, it was clear to Xietain that overconfidence would only kill him sooner rather than later. However, all thoughts of joining the government and the military disappeared 100% yesterday when he gained control of over 1,000 survivors and obtained the lower leader subclass. It was simply impossible for him to surrender such a large source of power, and Xietain was very clear that if he joined the government it would be impossible for him to keep his forces intact. Hand over the firearms, his treasures, rations, the survivors. These were all things that Xietain could not afford to lose no matter what. However, there was a problem. He looked at Shangguan Bingshui, Chen He, and Wu Yijun before sighing secretly. He was already starting to feel a headache coming on. What do you all think about it? Xietain inquired in a deep voice. This is a great thing. Chen He exclaimed in relief. If the Yanqing district government still remains on its feet, then it is highly likely that the rest of the country will have at least some kind of order established as well. Wu Yijun shook her head and while looking at her friend pointed out, he is just a mayor, Chen He. Besides, this man Bai Yong can only barely represent the Baiquan subdistrict and not the entire Yanqing district. The central government didn't necessarily manage to hold its own. As everyone expressed their opinions and ideas on the broadcast heard, Shangguan Bingshui had her head down seemingly deep in thought. It was only after a long time that she finally looked at Xietain and asked, "What do you think about it?" Xietain, who had also been silent, looked at her and calmly responded, "Even if we want to reach Baiquan camp we need to cross half a subdistrict, so it is not something that can be accomplished in 1 or 2 days, considering the current situation." Shangguan Bingshui nodded and after thinking for a moment said quietly, "Besides, I would like to see the situation inside the camp before making a decision. I think it's not necessarily a good thing to join the government." Wu Yijun furrowed her eyebrows tightly and seemed to realize something as she said, "That's right. Who can guarantee that those at the higher-ups didn't get corrected after acquiring real power and strange skills? Considering the current situation in which China and probably the whole world finds itself, relying too much on old agencies might be the first step to fall." Hearing this, even Chen He frowned and fell under deep contemplation. None of the three were ordinary people. They had lived or had some kind of close contact with the government and military forces since they were young, so they knew well how high society worked. The higher up someone was, the higher they wanted to be, and the less willing they were to take orders from another being. This was an irrefutable reality, and now that society had collapsed, why would they have to be guided by the old rules and norms then? Xietain was silent and after a moment's consideration concluded, "Then we will infiltrate Camp Baiquan. We can decide after seeing the situation there. That's the best idea." Shangguan Bingshui nodded and the rest also agreed. Soon, the three of them separated and began to perform different tasks. When only Xietain was left inside the room, Lilith entered through the door in her lily form. Seeing him still deep in thought, she calmly asked, "Why do you still care about their opinion? Considering your current strength, even that woman Shangguan Bingshui couldn't even survive 10 seconds in front of you." Xietain looked at her and could not help but secretly sigh. Lilith really was the most incredible woman he had ever met. Not for nothing, she was a sixth-order existence after all. Even wearing a pair of black jeans and a white blouse, and even when her appearance was slightly above average, her innate charm was still terrifying. After appreciating the beauty in front of him for a few seconds, he closed his eyes and calmly replied, "Indeed, I could force them all. But that wouldn't make me a leader, I'd be a tyrant, you know? It's harder to be a good leader than a good tyrant." Lilith pointed and sat down next to him. "Maybe." Xietain nodded, secretly savoring her natural fragrance. "But if I lie and force them now, in the future I won't be able to form my own faction with great powerhouses. Although I would love to move solo, to do that I need to be at the top and, unfortunately, I am only at the bottom of the food pyramid. To help you, whatever it is, I'll probably need a lot of power." Lilith's beautiful eyes glittered curiously and she pursed her lips into a charming smile. "I see you've thought a lot further ahead than I thought. In fact, many things would be easier for you if you simply used pure power. But in the long run, your losses would be astronomical and you would probably even perish halfway through." Xietain chuckled and walked towards the exit while thinking that even an elephant could not defeat several million ants united. After 2 days, different jobs were delegated to the survivors of the beginning village. Although not all were able to get a job and the vast majority still had to make do with the 3 bowls of gruel a day, none complained and happily ate what they were given. During the past 2 days, the new armed militia was also properly formed, totaling over 60 men armed with different types of firearms. Since Xietain had no experience in the military environment and Chen he was born into a military family, he had to go to him to learn a bit. In the end, the 60 armed troops were divided into 3 groups of 20 men each with a main leader at the head being Shangguan Bing Shui, Chen He, and Wu Yijuan. While rations were now plentiful, every grain of rice consumed was a grain of rice that was lost forever. Although some seeds had been planted in the surrounding fields, it would take time to see if they would germinate or not, and if they did not, it was necessary to know if this was the case in all the lands or only in some areas. There was still much to do and many things unknown about the soul record. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 136, First Day and Before Consuming the Fruit, Loyal Follower. During the 2 days in which Wu Yijuan, Shangguan Bing Shui, Chen He, and the rest were in charge of delegating labors and training the armed militia, Xietain was busy with other important matters. In the middle of the forest about 2 kilometers away from the beginning village. On the first day he took control of the village after killing the previous leaders, a few hours after he and the rest arrived from the workshop and blacksmith shop where he worked before the arrival of the soul record on Earth. Xietain was sitting on the branch of a huge tree. In front of him, about 50 feet away, the apparently lifeless body of Yang Pei lay carelessly on the grass. Although the wind was blowing and some branches or dry leaves were falling on his face, he showed no signs of awakening. It had not yet been 24 hours since Xietain forced Yang Pei to consume the fruit from the mutated plant, so until the exact moment arrived it was highly improbable that he would be able to wake up from the deep sleep he had fallen into. The fever had disappeared several hours ago, but even then it seemed that his body was getting used to something because, according to Lilith, the mana inside Yang Pei's body was unstable. According to her, he was probably just finishing digesting the effects of the fruit before finally opening his eyes again or bursting into a bloody mist. As to which of the 2 cases would happen, Xietain was not sure, but just in case he decided to stay away from the village to avoid problems. Time passed and Xietain remained in place without getting down from the tree as from his position he had a wide view of the surroundings. That way, he could prevent himself from being surrounded by any kind of enemy and avoid surprise attacks. While it was true that his blood will skill seemed to activate when enemies appeared within 100 meters of him as the center, Xietain did not know how the skill worked yet, so he did not dare to trust his life to it. Approximately 3 hours later, Xietain slowly stood up on the thick branch he was sitting on and looked forward with an excited smile. This scum is waking up and it didn't explode? That means that plant is, as I guessed, an incredible treasure. Lilith, floating a few meters away from him, smiled brightly and nodded as she heartily congratulated, "Congratulations, little Xietain. Now you will be able to become more powerful than you already are and probably take a great leap forward." Xietain nodded and rubbed his hands together eagerly as he waited for a great performance from Yang Pei. Just in case, he had brought along a couple of grenades, as although he was confident in his strength, if that plant gave Yang Pei some strange power he was not willing to take any risks and would simply explode him into pieces. Ugh. It hurts like hell. Unfortunately, the first thing that came out of Yang Pei's mouth was a groan followed by a loud curse. The only one of the 4 bosses alive looked at Xietain from several meters away and his eyes turned blood red as he shouted, "Damn bastard. If my legs were healthy, I swear to God I would cut you into a million pieces. But before that I must let you suffer hell on earth." The excited expression on Xietan's face disappeared completely and his face turned black as the bottom of a pot. "What's that all about?" he muttered dumbfounded. "Wasn't this little dog supposed to receive some strange power?" Lilith descended and stood beside him as she looked at the man who was still cursing relentlessly. After a moment of consideration, she pointed out, "Some plants give stats, some confer skills, some even awaken the latent power of skills we already possessed or are even capable of upgrading treasures. So?" Xietain urged her to continue, feeling anxious like a small child. Lilith looked at him with a smile and reminded him of something he had overlooked. "So, unless that plant was focused on treasures, that Yang Pei guy probably won't be able to demonstrate the power he received since you broke his limbs." Xietain was dumbfounded and looked at her as if he was looking at an otherworlder, which, ironically enough, she was. Lilith also looked at him silently, with a charming smile, just as she always did. Bastard! It was only when Yang Pei's enraged roar thundered through the forest that Xietain finally reacted. He looked at Yang Pei's squirming legs and sighed as he shook his head before leaping forward. He fell 2 meters away from where Yang Pei lay and looked at him coldly. Yang Pei, who a moment ago was roaring and shouting that he was going to cut him into a million pieces, got scared, and the yell that was about to come out of his mouth ended up getting stuck in the middle of his throat. He knew he was no match for the young man in front of him, but Yang Pei was used to being rampant and wild, so in the end, he ended up acting contrary to what his brain was telling him he should do if he wanted to have a slim hope of survival. Really? I should have left you at least one leg unharmed. Xietain shook his head and said words that scared the young evolver even more. Unfortunately, before he could say anything, Xietain raised his foot high and then lowered it once more, but with all his might. Bang! You have acquired the soul power of Yang Pei level 20. Yang Pei's head banged into pieces, splattering blood and flesh everywhere. However, Xietan's foot not only pierced through the sturdy body of an evolutionary level 20 with apparent ease, but continued further and made a small hole about 30 centimeters wide in the ground as well. Without Yang Pei's constant cursing, the forest became silent once again until Xietan's voice rang out again. Well, although I don't know what benefit this plant confers, I at least know that it is a treasure capable of boosting a person's strength. Lilith's seductive voice followed right behind. That means you can now consume the fruit by yourself and wait for the results. Xietain looked up at the blue sky for a few minutes, pondering what to do next as the cool breeze blew against his face. After nearly 10 minutes of consideration, he began to walk away as he muttered, "Let me make a few final preparations before finally consuming the fruit." After Xietain left the forest and returned to the beginning village, the first thing he did was to look for Conlan and Kai Jingyi. Inside the main village, sitting on a couch, Xietain looked at the 2 pretty women in front of him and asked in a deep voice, "So, what did you think of what I said to you just now?" The 2 girls looked at each other before standing up at the same time. Conlan was the first to kneel in front of him, and as she looked down said with resolve and determination, "I am willing to become your loyal follower and follow you to the top or to the bottom of the abyss." Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 137 Mutant Plant Effect, Lightning Movement. Immediately, not even a second after Conlan finished speaking, Kai Jingyi knelt on one knee just as knights did in the Middle Ages before the king, and solemnly swore. "Kai Jingyi is willing to be your loyal follower. If you shine and are admired by countless, your radiance will enlighten me. If the darkness devours you and you are hated by the world, I will accompany you so that you will not feel lonely." Xietain looked at the 2 young women kneeling in front of him and his lips curved slightly upward. After leaving the forest after checking that the effects of the fruit coming from the mutant plant were not evil and ending Yang Pei's life, Xietain immediately returned, and the first thing he did was to look for Conlan and Kai Jingyi. While he could have gone to look for Fu Xiefeng and Zhong De, the reasons why Xietain chose Kai Jingyi and Conlan was to ask them if they wished to be his loyal followers after explaining the effects of the skill were varied. However, he had 2 main reasons. 1. The first reason was that while Conlan could take the lives of numerous enemies after activating her poisonous cloud skill, Kai Jingyi was fast enough to confuse the enemy and kill them quickly while protecting Conlan. In addition, Kai Jingyi's speed was also perfect for leaving the range of Conlan's skill since it did not differentiate between allies and enemies. 2. The second reason was mainly based on Conlan. Although she was strong, her chosen path was pure magic, unlike Shangguan Bing Shui. Therefore, her physical stats, while more powerful than the average person, were also not outstanding or high enough. Therefore, Xietain wanted to give her, who was his only healer, a means of preserving her life in times of need. Aside from these 2 main reasons, there was a third. This third reason was that the 2 girls seemed more willing to kill in order to maintain their lives and dignity. Because after consuming the fruit of the mutant plant he would go into a coma in order for his body to adapt to the changes his soul would undergo with the intervention of the soul record, Xietain urgently needed people he could trust 100% without fear of being stabbed in his sleep to protect him. while Bai Zemin trusted Kong Lan, Kai Jingyi, Fu Xiefeng, and Zhong De enough as he did not believe any of them were evil enough to bite the hand that saved their lives, made them grow, and even nurtured them. It was better to be forewarned. Therefore, Bai Zemin wanted to put a seal, something similar to a leash that would prevent this kind of problem and at the same time improve their confidence in each other. It was precisely because of this that he explained to the two girls the effects of the skill coming from his lower leader subclass. Seeing them accept without hesitation, Bai Zemin nodded in satisfaction, as this meant that neither of them had intended to betray him at any point in time. From the beginning, none of them had even a distant thought of betraying him. After all, they were both grateful to Bai Zemin in many ways. He thought he had only given them power, but he had done much more than this. Bai Zemin had made the timid Kai Jingyi more confident, made the lonely Kong Lan gain friends she could trust. He saved their lives on numerous occasions, pushed them to quickly get used to the changing world in order to survive. He gave them strength and still continued to help them relentlessly. He had done so much for them. Therefore, when he told them about the skill of his subclass, none of them hesitated and accepted immediately. Then let's finish this. He did not hesitate and immediately activated the skill attached to his subclass. Bai Zemin felt a slight pain in his soul as if someone had pricked him with a needle, but soon that pain disappeared and the body of the two kneeling women lit up with a bright light of a faint reddish color. Due to the activation of your subclass skill, these two women will never be able to betray you. The voice of Lilith, who was invisible and undetectable by all except him, sounded beside him. This is because a small fragment of your soul is linked to that of these people. It is also for this reason that those who become a loyal follower can use a small part of your overall power. Bai Zemin nodded imperceptibly, and the light illuminating the two girls disappeared completely at the same time as a message flashed in his retina. You have chosen the unclassified existences Kong Lan and Kai Jingyi as your loyal followers. February 2nd. The two girls looked at each other blankly and slowly stood up. This is all? Kai Jingyi asked in confusion. Neither she nor Kong Lan felt any kind of change in their bodies or thought processes. They had expected something different, but everything was seemingly the same as before. That's all. Bai Zemin stood up from the couch and said in a serious voice, I will now begin to absorb a power coming from a mutant fruit, so I will be out for 24 hours. During that time I will need you to protect me. The two girls nodded with serious expressions as they clearly understood how grave the matter was. After all, with all the things he had done, it was only natural that some people were unhappy with Bai Zemin. As he walked to his room on the top floor of the villa, Bai Zemin ordered, during that time, if anyone is looking for me, just tell them that I am busy with something important, no need to explain any further. If anyone tries to break in, then just kill them. Yes. The two women looked at each other and nodded with determination. Sitting on the edge of his bed inside his room, Bai Zemin took out a red fruit from the mutant plant very carefully. Because he had used one on Yangpei earlier to confirm whether the fruit was edible or not, now that he was going to eat another one, he only left one remaining of the original three. Go and hurry back. Standing beside the bed, Lilith looked at him with a beautiful smile. Bai Zemin looked at her and couldn't help but laugh. Ha ha ha. Lilith, why do you make it sound like I'm going to another world? Without waiting for a reply, he leaned back on the bed and casually threw the mutant fruit into his mouth. His face scrunched up and he couldn't help but curse inwardly. Unlike in fantasy novels or comic books where the divine fruits were incredibly sweet and tasty, the fruit he had just consumed was incredibly sour, so much so that eating lemon was only kid stuff in comparison. However, he had no time to complain as he immediately felt his body burning. It burned as if he had been thrown into a spring of boiling water. It was so bad that even before he could grunt in pain, his eyes rolled back in his head and passed out. Seeing his breathing slightly uneven but calm and his chest heaving gently, Lilith leaned forward. Her face rested only a couple of centimeters away from Bai Zemin's face. She could even feel his breath caressing her face softly as her black hair fell like a night veil down the sides, covering both of their faces from the outside. Her red eyes glittered like precious gems and she pursed her lips, millimeters from his. She whispered softly, hurry up and wake up, little Zemin. This big sister is curious to see what you get. Then, she took a step back and sat on the edge of the bed as she looked at him silently. A day passed quickly, and after the beginning of the second day since the fall of the previous 4 leaders, a great number of survivors had been given different jobs to do, and the initial armed militia had finally formed properly. After 24 hours of silent agony, Xietan's eyelashes moved imperceptibly. However, this small movement could not escape the strong and sharp senses of the higher existence present. Finally awake, hearing the most beautiful voice of the most charming and dangerous woman he had ever met in his entire life, Xietain smiled and opened his eyes slowly. Congratulations! You have learned second order active skill level 5 lightning movement, Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 138 Important information from Xietain. Xietain blinked several times at the message flashing in green letters across his retina, and the smile that had formed on his face after hearing Lilith's charming voice widened. Noticing his face practically beaming with joy, Lilith couldn't help but find it cute and amusing at the same time. Seeing the excitement in your eyes, I guess I don't need to ask. Lilith smiled slightly and sat down next to him as she stretched her hand forward. Xietain looked at her flawless hand and chuckled. If it was before, he might not understand her intention, but after more than half a month of living together and practically never separating, it was easy for him to know what she wanted. Without saying a word in return, he took her delicate hand in his clearly larger one. His movement was so gentle that he seemed afraid of hurting her, even though he knew such a thing was impossible. Soon, the description of the newly acquired skill flickered across both of their retinas. Lightning movement, second order active skill, level 5. This is a skill capable of increasing the user's movement speed and slightly utilizing the power of lightning. First activation, after consuming 40 stamina points, it increases agility by plus 70 points for 5 minutes. Second activation, consumes 5 stamina points to make a lightning clone that can use 10% of the user's overall power. In addition, it consumes 1 stamina point per second for each clone. Currently, a maximum of 3 clones can be created. Seeing how powerful the skill acquired after consuming the mutant fruit was, Xietain had to restrain the urge to want to roar at the sky. 70 points of agility. That was the terrifying amount of boost this skill granted him, and for a total of 5 full minutes. Even with the consumption of 40 stamina points, it was nothing compared to the benefits. This skill had so many uses that Xietain didn't know where to start. Fleeing, dodging, chasing, killing, helping teammates, etc. Simply too many uses to describe them all. Furthermore, the second activation of the lightning movement skill was even more powerful than the first activation, depending on how one used it. Oh? Lilith also raised an eyebrow and pointed out, this skill is one of the most powerful skills that the Heaven's Army's Archangel Gabriel possesses. Of course, his lightning movement is far more advanced than yours currently. Don't worry, there will come a time when he will eat the dust I left behind. Xietain stood up and said confidently. Lilith held back the urge to laugh and said excitedly, that will be fun to see. But let me tell you just in case, but the archangels are almost all in the 7th order. Cough. Cough. Xietain began coughing viciously and nearly choked to death. He could even feel his face getting hot with embarrassment. Due to the enthusiasm of the moment, he couldn't help but say words in a big way. Little did he expect that his own words would turn around to bite him so soon. I'd better get going. Xietain wisely did not comment further on the matter and walked towards the door. Lots of work to do. Lilith shook her head, not knowing whether to laugh or cry, and followed him as she calmly reminded him, the order in existence is and does not represent that they are more powerful. I think you already know that from how you were able to defeat beings way higher than you when you didn't even have your main class yet. Still. 7th order. Xietain thought silently. That was even higher than Lilith. As Xietain walked down the stairs, he heard a few voices and easily identified most of them. However, the content of the conversation caused his brow to furrow slightly. We already said yesterday that he is busy and can't attend to anyone. Kai Jingyi's helpless voice rang out. Busy? This time it was Shangguan Bing Shui answering, and she was clearly a little upset. This is important. In fact, it could be said that he will benefit the most from all of this overall, but you're telling me he's busy? We're just saying what he told us to say in case anyone is looking for him. Kong Lan sighed. Before anyone else could say anything, Bai Zemin came into the room and looked at Shangguan Bingshui before calmly asking, "What's wrong?" Seeing that even you, who is usually calm, is agitated like this, it must be something really important. Not only was Shangguan Bingshui present, there was also Chen He, Wu Yijun, Fu Xiefeng, Zhong De, and even Luo Cheng. They all seemed anxious about something, and had it not been for Kai Jingyi and Kong Lan insisting on not letting anyone pass, they would have gone looking for him. Shangguan Bingshui rolled her eyes and couldn't help but complain, "Where have you been? We've been looking for you since yesterday for a matter of grave importance." "I'm sorry, but it was something really important." Bai Zemin apologized honestly and gestured for everyone to sit down. As a leader, he knew that disappearing for too long was not a good thing. Much less now that his position was just consolidating properly and was still not a 100% sure thing. However, circumstances had forced him. After all, the sooner he consumed the fruit, the sooner he could become more powerful. "Let's forget about that and do what's really important here." "Chen," he exclaimed with a serious voice and a touch of excitement. He spread a map of the Ruilin subdistrict on the table before looking at Wu Yijun. Wu Yijun nodded slightly and stood up. Her graceful figure was shown at its best with the tight clothes she was wearing, and her expression together with her baby face was unbelievably charming. Bai Zemin looked at her for a few seconds before looking at the map, which was mostly green due to the large number of wooded areas in the surrounding region. After about a minute or two of staring completely focused at the map on the table, Wu Yijun pointed to a particular area and said confidently, "In the past, I came to this place with my grandfather. At that time a military camp was being built in the area, and because of his position in the government he personally inspected the task. It's been a few years since then, but I still remember the area vividly. I'm sure there should be some military equipment and weapons in this place," she concluded before looking at Bai Zemin with a smile shaping two beautiful dimples on her cheeks and left even Chen He stunned. Bai Zemin was dumbfounded at first, but then the joy made his blood boil furiously. A military camp. His heart was beating like a wild horse at the thought and possibility of acquiring the weapons of a military camp. Just by raiding a local police station, Yi Qigong and the other three had managed to arm several dozen men without a problem and obtain many supplies and resources. If what Wu Yijun said was true and there really was a military camp stationed there, then Bai Zemin could start moving in a southerly direction immediately. The whole process of meeting his family again would become a lot easier. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 139, Royalty and Long-Term Contract. It was only after hearing Wu Yijun's announcement that Bai Zemin finally understood the reason why even the generally cold Shangguan Bingshui was so agitated. At the same time, he also came to understand why she said that in the end, the one who would benefit most from everything would be him. After all, if there really was an armed camp stationed in that place, many things would be easier for him and, as a leader, it was natural to want his own power to grow and expand. Bai Zemin looked at the beautiful Wu Yijun and asked with a frown, "Although it's none of my business, but may I know who your grandfather is? I know you come from a prominent family, but to think that even your grandfather has a high enough rank to know confidential information and even be able to take his granddaughter to such a place." Wu Yijun smiled sweetly and answered in all honesty, "My grandfather is Wu Jianhong and my father is Wu Keqian. You probably already heard about my grandfather, and since your family is resident of Chongping district, I assume you already heard his name too." Wu Jianhong. Bai Zemin muttered and his eyes grew wide. Your grandfather is the premier of China?" When Wu Yijun nodded naturally, the place fell silent for a second before a series of gasps could be heard in unison. Except for Chen He and Shangguan Bingshui, who already knew about Wu Yijun's family background, everyone in the room gasped as they stared at the woman in front of them. Even Bai Zemin himself was shocked for a moment. Although the world had changed, it was hard to shake off 20 years of living in a normal family. For him, the premier of China was a supreme and absolute existence, but now, in front of his eyes, the beloved granddaughter of the second most powerful man in the whole country was looking at him with a charming smile. Besides, even if the world had changed, if Wu Yijun's family did not collapse and her grandfather continued on his feet, it was only a matter of time before they would rise to power again. But rather than feeling relieved and joyful, what Bai Zemin felt was a severe headache. For it was highly probable that in the future he would have to fight the entire old regime unless he was willing to surrender his armed power, something that was simply impossible. How could he casually surrender to all their efforts? Xietain shook his head and looked at her curiously without letting his inner thoughts reveal themselves. I see. Then it makes sense that you would know such information. Also, to think that your father is actually the mayor of Chongping district. You sure or something, eh? Wu Yijun shook her head and smiled bitterly. To be honest, sometimes I wish I was born in a normal family. Besides, I hope you can continue to treat me the same way you've done so far and my family won't affect your way of thinking about me. Shangguan Bingshui, Chen He, and the others inside the room looked at Xietain waiting for his reaction, but he simply nodded slightly and said with a casual smile, of course. You don't need to worry about that. Although I'm surprised, that's all. With today's world, I don't think the past matters much considering that practically the entire society fell down. He. Wu Yijun smiled sweetly and her eyes curved into a crescent moon shape. She looked at him and asked somewhat curiously, Xietain, do you have a girlfriend? Xietain was taken by surprise and for a moment did not know what to say. Not only him, Shangguan Bingshui opened her beautiful eyes and looked at her friend in shock. Yijun, you. Chen He also couldn't believe what he was hearing. What? Wu Yijun shrugged and said innocently, I'm not asking him to go out with me. I just asked out of curiosity, that's all. The corner of Chen He's mouth twitched a couple of times as if he wanted to say something, but in the end he shook his head and remained silent. Maybe Wu Yijun's act could fool everyone here, but he and Shangguan Bingshui knew her too well after all. I don't currently have a girlfriend. Xietain replied and closed his eyes before opening them again. Before anyone could say anything, he added, but you could say that I have a long-term contract with a woman to whom I owe a lot. Oh? Wu Yijun looked interested and narrowed her eyes. In fact, everyone looked curious and looked at him. They wanted to know what kind of person she was to make even in this world he would remember her like that. Even though he had been forced to do so many things to survive and had gone through so many hardships, there was still such a woman in his mind. You should know that there were actually dozens, if not hundreds of women of different ages who would be more than willing to become his woman, but Xietain never gave any of them a second glance. In fact, since the beginning of the apocalypse he was never seen to be too close to any woman except for occasional conversations with Wu Yijun or small contacts with Shangguan Bingshui. Invisible and away from everyone's sight, the woman who was the center of conversation watched and listened to everything with a bright smile that, fortunately or unfortunately, no one could see. A long-term contract, eh? I like how it sounds. After more than an hour of deliberation, the group finally made the decision to start moving in a southerly direction as fortunately the armed camp was located in one of the forests about 150 kilometers away from where the beginning village was situated. This was a matter of utmost urgency, just as Shangguan Bingshui had said earlier. Mainly due to the fact that they currently only had a little over 15,000 rounds of ammunition and the grenades did not even number 20. With such low ammunition and considering the low hit rate that people without military training could have against zombie heads, out of those 15,000 rounds of ammunition it was improbable that more than 1,000 zombies could be killed, and this was already a generous estimate. Xietain also asked what had happened during the day he was away and learned that Shangguan Bingshui had the brilliant idea to divide the entire village into 3 areas and 3 groups. The groups were as follows. Normal citizens, they lived in the worst housing in the outer ring of the village, so the security was also lower. It was composed of those who did not want to work or who simply did not have any useful ability or the courage to fight. Noble citizens, they lived in the middle area of the village. Their living conditions were considerably better than those of the normal citizens as they were not only safer but also received better food. They were composed of those who did work and did not differentiate between doctor or animal keeper as all professions were important nowadays. Royalty, they lived in the central area of the village. Their houses were the best and their living conditions were far superior to those of the 2 previous groups. The royalty consisted of those who actively fought on the front lines against zombies, evolved beasts, and any other enemy of the village. Because they were at the greatest risk, they could eat the best food and enjoy the best treatment. Unlike the first two groups, the royalty members were differentiated as there were the militants and the main leaders as well as the top leader, who was currently Xietain. This type of setup was incredibly simple and even rustic in a sense. However, the reason Xietain openly praised Shangguan Bing Shui for thinking of such an idea was because since they only had a little over 1,000 survivors, such simplicity made the divisions extremely clear and everyone's work would be much easier. Furthermore, with this clear distinction, the survivors would slowly begin to realize that the world was no longer as it was before and that if they wanted better treatment they should not expect help from anyone but themselves since, unlike in the past, here there was no government to complain to. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 140 Working with the Evolved Beast Bodies. With the guidance of Wu Yijun, Xietain visited the place where an important task was being carried out in order for him to advance and enhance his own personal power and that of his followers even further. A step behind the two, Lilith in her human form followed them silently as she looked around calmly. In a large walled courtyard which was being protected by a total of 10 men armed with Type 79 submachine guns and 3 magazines of ammunition each, a group of survivors was huddled in different parts of the place working tirelessly. Leader by Xiao Min, one of the first militants to surrender before Xietain and one of the few to survive, quickly advanced and bowed respectfully when he saw him appear in the courtyard. Because of her beauty, Wu Yijun received several stares, but she was already used to it, so she acted as if nothing. Besides, after 1 or 2 peeks, no one dared to continue looking for fear of losing their heads. Xietain nodded toward Xiao Min and asked in a deep voice, "How is the work going?" Xiao Min also focused on him and hurriedly replied while pointing to the different spots in the courtyard, "Thanks to the new rules, all the survivors are very satisfied. No one dares to slack off because they know that if they lose this job they will go hungry again and their families will return to indigence again." Xietain nodded silently and watched the scene with satisfaction. More than 200 survivors were surrounding different mutant beasts and taking care of their bodies without daring to be neglected. With one of the first order's evolved cat claws or a shadow tiger claw that Xietain had killed before leaving the university, the survivors were tearing off the scales of the first order's Jiaolao snakes. Although it was difficult to do, with the evolved snakes dead, the survivors could put the hard, sharp claw between the small spaces between each scale and slowly pry it away from the flesh. Elsewhere, a group of survivors with expertise in tailoring was taking care of the different skins such as the skin of the platinum ape, shadow tiger, gale cat, etc. Using metal pieces from the shell of one of the first order blazing beetles, they were carefully cutting the skin, and when the fur was completely removed from the body it was placed in large wooden bundles and tied with strings so that they were well stretched. In that way, the fur of the other beasts was slowly beginning to dry. "Looks good," Wu Yijun said cheerfully and looked at Xietain with a cute smile. "Xietain, follow me. I'll take you there." Xietain looked at her smile and his mood seemed to improve a bit. After following her and walking several meters, he finally saw one of his main objectives for this visit. The 4-meter-tall and approximately 7-meter-long body of the reinforced iron boar lay lifeless in a large open field. Surrounding it were several survivors with bitter expressions. Seeing Xietain and the 2 beauties approaching, a middle-aged man with several parts of his hair already white quickly advanced and bowed. "Leader by." The rest of the survivors surrounding the reinforced iron boar's body also bowed and quickly greeted. Xietain nodded and looked at the middle-aged man. "Xingyang, I heard that you have problems with this boy?" Xingyang smiled bitterly and nodded. He pointed at the reinforced iron boar jabali as he said, "Leader by, this monster's armor is too tough. Even with the beast claws you gave us it is simply impossible to break through the defenses." Even with the Shenyuan sword, Xietain had not been able to break through the defenses of the First Order reinforced iron boar, so he was not too surprised to hear such a statement. In fact, if it wasn't for his terrifying strength and agility as well as the help of his blood berserker class, he could never have killed such a terrifying monster. "It's all right. Do you think you can handle it if I make a breakthrough?" Xietain frowned slightly and asked. After all, it was impossible for him to stay too long here guarding the iron-reinforced boar. He still needed to expand southward and he couldn't afford to waste time at the beginning of the apocalypse as it would kill him in the intermediate stages. Xingyang was silent for a moment and after careful reflection nodded. "I think it's possible if we remove some extra flesh. Then let's do it like this." Bai Zemin nodded and waved his hand back. Wu Yijun, Lily, Jungde, and the rest of the survivors quickly retreated, clearing the area around the giant monster. Bai Zemin took out a bottle of blazing beetle blood from his backpack and casually scattered it on the ground. Then, he concentrated fully, and under the astonished eyes of the survivors, the blood began to move slowly. Under his control, the gruesome-looking blood soon took solid form and turned into a long sharp ruby-colored sword that reflected the sun's rays. Bai Zemin's face turned slightly pale as to form this sword he had consumed 150 mana points. If it were before, such an action would be difficult, but with his 300+ mana points, it was not too much of a problem except for a slight faintness that disappeared as soon as it appeared. The sword floated on its own and fell gently into his right hand. Then, under the eyes filled with envy, admiration, and trepidation of the survivors, Bai Zemin activated the skill attached to the blazing ring in his right hand. The temperature in the place rose explosively, and everyone was forced to take several steps back with fear-filled eyes as they looked at the crimson flame that had appeared out of nowhere and danced softly on the blood sword. Bai Zemin advanced, and with a slight jump, his body flashed and appeared above the head of the reinforced iron boar. He observed carefully and after a moment's consideration pierced the center of the monster's forehead. Wu Yijun's eyes glittered with a hint of disbelief as she noticed how the hard metal armor that even with her skill she could not damage even a little bit, began to slowly give way. The metal armor that came in contact with the tip of the blood sword began to gradually melt as the burning flames did their work. After the tip of the sword pierced and reached the monster's flesh, Bai Zemin stopped trying to go deeper and began to walk upwards from the head slowly while dragging the blazing blood sword along with his movements. With great care and concentration, the metal armor began to slowly open under Bai Zemin's attention, forming a long line that stretched from the forehead to the back of the creature's body. As Bai Zemin finished the work, Wu Yijun looked at Lily and asked curiously, "May I know how long you have known Bai Zemin?" "I don't think you have only known each other for a couple of days." Lily looked at her as if surprised by the sudden question and asked back, "May I know what is the reason why you think so?"